Cottonport is a quiet, do-nothing town in Avoyelles Parish, Louisiana. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your business better than you do, and Saturday afternoons are spent on the front porch sipping iced tea, or maybe something stronger, as long as the preacher isn't coming by to visit. But in the summer of 2014, Cottonport wasn't the sleepy burg it usually was. In the summer of 2014, there was a murder. Welcome back to the Agatha May Detective Agency. I'm Agatha May, and I'm so glad you're here. In this episode, we're going to be looking at a case that took almost a decade before there was any kind of justice. On June 27, 2014, Megan Parra, a schoolteacher and mother of two boys, was in a car accident. She ran off the road and hit a tree. She told her mother, Missy Ducote, that she was just distracted when she veered off the road, but told her father, Steve, that her brakes quit working and she hit the tree to keep from driving into the bayou. The brakes on Megan's car were never checked. Megan was taken to the hospital, treated for a cut to her hand, and then her husband, Dustin, took her home. Her two boys went to her parents' house to spend the night. The next morning, Megan texted her mother, Missy, to make sure the boys were okay. Missy called Megan and told her that once they'd all had breakfast, they'd bring her some and bring the boys to her. About an hour later, Megan's husband, Dustin, called Missy. He said that Megan was going to take a bath and he was going to Walmart to pick up a prescription for her, and that he would come by and get the boys once he was finished. Another hour passed by and Dustin still hadn't picked up the kids, so Megan's parents went ahead and took the boys back home. When they entered the house, they found Megan on the floor of the living room with a gunshot wound to the head. Megan was still alive, but barely. Her mother called her parents to pick up the boys, and Steve called Dustin. Missy is a nurse practitioner, so she began rendering first aid to her daughter. Dustin arrived, and since he's a nurse, he began assisting Missy with the first aid. Megan was airlifted to a trauma center in Lafayette, but in less than 24 hours, the doctors had determined that there wasn't anything else they could do for her. She was taken off of life support and her organs were donated. David Blanchard had been the first officer to arrive on the scene that morning. He took over 100 photos of the scene, including one of a guitar laying on the floor and a photo of a wine rack that was turned over and laying behind a chair. It appeared there had been a struggle, but either the investigators didn't pay attention to the photos or just didn't bother to do their job. 2 days after the shooting, Christopher Knight, the lead detective on the case, went to Megan's parents' home and told her father that he had tested the gun and Megan's fingerprints were all over it. He said Dustin's were on it too, but that was expected since it was Dustin's gun. Christopher Knight later denied ever saying that, but he did eventually admit that he never had the gun tested. Before the coroner had ever even given his ruling, Christopher Knight had returned that gun back to Dustin Parra. Dustin gave conflicting stories about where he was when Steve called him the morning of Megan's death. He told 3 different people 3 different versions, but Knight never tried to suss out those contradictions. There was a note left on the kitchen counter the day of the shooting that was allegedly written by Megan, but her father told investigators that it wasn't her handwriting. Again, the investigators didn't investigate. I would think that comparing handwriting should be an easy task for even the simplest of detectives, but they just couldn't be arsed to do it. They also didn't follow up on a rumor that Dustin was having an affair. Within 4 days, Christopher Knight had closed Megan's case as a suicide. His entire report was a single page. Weeks later, the autopsy report would agree that Megan's death was a suicide. Megan's parents didn't accept that, though. They didn't feel as though a proper investigation had been made, and they suspected that Dustin was the one who had shot Megan. When Dustin had arrived at the house the day Megan was shot, he did some odd things. The first thing was that he slipped in the blood on the floor and ended up with blood all over his shorts. Megan's father said it looked as though he had done it on purpose, like he was sliding into home plate. The second odd thing Dustin did was immediately after sliding, he pulled a photo out of Megan's shirt pocket, the same paper shirt that she had been given to wear in the ER the night before. It was a photo of their boys. He also pushed the gun to the side, even though it wasn't in the way of him performing first aid. But Dustin had a receipt from his pharmacy purchase that was time-stamped at 9:43 a.m. that was supposed to be his alibi. How could he have been the one to shoot Megan if he wasn't even home that morning? The doors to the house had been locked and there was no sign of forced entry. So if no one had broken in and Dustin wasn't home, who was left other than Megan to have held the gun? Well, not so fast. The pathologist couldn't pinpoint the time of Megan's death. What if she had been shot before Dustin left for Walmart? Maybe when he called Missy to tell her that Megan was going to take a bath, Megan had already been shot. 4 months after her death, Megan's father, Steve, talked a judge into reopening Megan's case. The judge asked Commander Dan Schaub of the Avoyelles Parish Sheriff's Office to review the case. Schaub obtained all of the crime scene photos and that one-page report that Christopher Knight probably got a cramp from having to type, and then he spoke with Megan's neighbors. 2 neighbors reported hearing loud noises that morning, but they were at different times. One heard a noise a little after 7 and the other heard a noise at 9:15. For whatever reason, Dan Schaub decided to go with the 9:15 version. He came to the conclusion that the cause and manner of Megan's death should stand as originally reported. But Steve and Missy Ducote were not satisfied. They knew that Megan had never even shot a gun before, so why would she have chosen that as a way to end her life? They now had copies of all the crime scene photos, though, so Steve and their other daughter Betsy began examining them. They were the ones who questioned why that guitar and wine rack were on the floor. They looked at a copy of the autopsy report and discovered that Megan had bruising on her abdomen. The more they investigated Megan's death, the more questions they had, and the more they thought that perhaps Megan and Dustin had been fighting the morning she was shot. The autopsy also showed that the gun had been placed directly against Megan's head. But when Steve and Betsy looked at the photo that was taken of the gun at the crime scene, there wasn't any blood on it. It looked as though it had been wiped clean. But local authorities refused to reopen Megan's case. In 2017, Stephen reached out to the Avoyelles Parish District Attorney Charles Riddle. Steve showed him the crime scene photos and pointed out the discrepancies in Megan's case. Riddle was convinced that her death needed to be reinvestigated. But until the coroner was willing to change Megan's manner of death from suicide to undetermined, his hands were tied. So Riddle reached out to the coroner, Dr. Mayhew, and showed him the crime scene photos. There were some photos that he had never seen. He was also convinced that Megan's case needed to be reopened. So he sent a letter to the Louisiana State Police requesting that they look into the case. They did, but found that there was nothing wrong with the initial investigation. In 2018, Steve Ducote reached out to a friend of his from high school, David Lemoyne. David was a retired FBI agent who was living in Nebraska. He flew to Louisiana and met with Steve and spent a night poring over all the evidence that Steve had compiled. By the next morning, David had determined that Megan's death was decidedly not a suicide. He called in a friend of his, Zach Shelton, who was another retired FBI agent, to come help him with the case. The former agents talked the Cottonport police chief into deputizing them as officers in 2019. This gave them the authority to interview individuals involved in Megan's case, and it allowed them to record those interviews. On January 15, 2019, David Lemoyne and Zach Shelton interviewed Detective Christopher Knight, the original lead detective who did diddly squat of an investigation. In the interview, Knight admitted that he totally blew the investigation into Megan's death. He didn't use those exact words, but it was the same gist. He said the reason was because he just wasn't experienced enough at the time and told David and Zach that, quote, "If I botch this, then I mean, my fault, but was it done? But was it done on purpose? Absolutely not," end quote. Well, there's no if, Skippy. You botched it. And how in the heckety heck was he ever made lead detective of the case if he lacked experience to the point of not being able to perform even half of an investigation? David and Zach also questioned Megan's husband, Dustin. For over an hour, he denied having anything to do with Megan's death. He did, however, admit that he'd been having an affair. He said he didn't think Megan knew about it, though. Oh, she knew. David Lemoyne worked on Megan's case for 2 years, but passed away on December 28, 2020, after contracting COVID-19. He sadly never got to see the resolution of the case. While Steve was busy trying to prove that Dustin was guilty of Megan's murder, Dustin was busy getting remarried. He and his wife were raising his and Megan's 2 sons. In April 2021, Steve Ducote hired independent crime scene analyst Eric Richardson to examine the evidence. When Eric saw the photo of the shorts that Dustin had worn the morning of the shooting, those same shorts he tried to cover with blood with his baseball slide, Eric noticed that there was a fine mist of blood near one of the pockets. According to Eric, that fine mist could only be caused by high-velocity blood spatter. That meant that Dustin had to have been there when the gun went off. On October 13th, 2021, Avoyelles Parish District Attorney Charles Riddle took Megan's case to a grand jury, and Dustin was indicted on second-degree murder and an obstruction of justice charge. 5 days later, Dustin turned himself in at the Avoyelles Parish Jail. His bond was set at $300,000, and he bonded out that same day. Dustin was arraigned on October 21st and pleaded not guilty. Even though DA Riddle was convinced that Megan's case wasn't a suicide, he wasn't convinced that Dustin would necessarily be found guilty. He said that experts for the defense were going to testify that the blood spatter on Dustin's shorts didn't prove he was there when Megan was shot. So why do we even have experts testifying at trial if it's objective? We don't need opinion, we need facts. Dustin's trial was scheduled to begin on March 26, 2023. 3 days before the trial, Dustin's attorney reached out to DA Riddle with a deal. Dustin would agree to plead no contest to negligent homicide. After talking to Megan's parents, the DA accepted the deal with a stipulation that Dustin would have to answer specific questions under oath. While on the stand, Charles Riddle asked Dustin, question, "On the morning of June 28th, 2014, you and her, Megan, were arguing and she threatened to leave, correct?" Answer, "Yes, I'm not contesting as part of the nolo contendere plea." Question, "You had a pistol in your hand, and in the struggle the gun went off firing into her head, correct?" Answer, "Yes, I'm not contesting as part of the nolo contendere plea." Since Megan's autopsy showed that the gun had been held directly to her head, I think it's pretty safe to say that that's not really how it went down. Dustin was sentenced to 5 years and only served 9 months before he was released on parole. The Dakotas agreed to the plea because their main concern was that people knew that Megan hadn't ended her own life. It was especially important for their grandsons to know. In April of 2023, Steve and Missy Ducote were granted full custody of those grandsons. It took 9 years before Megan's family were ever able to see some semblance of justice served in her case. It was their love and determination that made it happen. They spent year after year after year digging into the evidence, reaching out to experts only to be turned away. But every time they got knocked down, they got back up and fought some more. So for all of you who are waiting for a determination in a death that you feel was falsely ruled a suicide or is undetermined, please don't give up. Keep fighting, keep digging, Keep being a bee in the bonnet of everyone in authority who isn't listening to what you're saying. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll be back soon with more on the Heather Turner case and another episode of Laced. Until next time, stay safe and be happy.